Today I'll be discussing and making recommendations for the reduction in demand for sex trafficking and prostitution through the implementation of education provided to solicitors of illegal commercial sex. The United States Bureau of Justice reports that 2,065 incidents of sex trafficking were investigated by law enforcement between 2008 and 2010. Of these incidents, 40% of the reported cases involved the prostitution of minor victims. From 2007 to 2012, the National Human Trafficking and Resources Center received reports of 5,932 cases of sex trafficking, the most common report involving pimp-controlled prostitution, in which 89% of the victims were women and 40% of which were under the age of 18. The average age was 11 to 14 years old. More recently, the National Human Trafficking Resources Center recorded 3,718 sex trafficking reports in 2018 alone. Additionally, it is reported that there are at least 100,000 victims in the United States, with 325,000 individuals considered at risk of becoming victims. The consequences of sex trafficking affect survivors, those arrested for soliciting sex, and communities at large. Macy and John, 2010, found that survivors of sex trafficking face lasting physical and psychological issues, including health issues as contracting sexually transmitted disease. Victims and survivors are also at risk to have continuous substance abuse issues, as illegal substances are used to mentally and physically control the victims of sex trafficking. Johns are also frequently victims of robbery, assault, and are at high risk of STDs. As a result, preliminary research has found that sex trafficking also plays a major role in the spread of HIV/AIDS. Whole communities continue to suffer. Many other illicit activities are correlated with prostitutes in the U.S., such as drug and gang-related crimes. Prostitution also drives away legitimate commercial business, is correlated with higher crime rates, and lower quality of life. In 2000, the United Nations agreed upon the exact definition of sex trafficking under the Palermo Protocol, which was created to prevent, lessen, and punish trafficking around the world. In the United States, sex trafficking is criminalized by the 2000 Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which defines sex trafficking as the use of force, fraud, or coercion to induce a person to engage in involuntary and illegal commercial sex, defined as sex acts in exchange for something of value. According to the Human Trafficking Hotline, in 2018 alone, there were 231 reported cases of sex trafficking in Arizona, with 486 contacts made with sex trafficking victims. Additionally, there have been 969 cases within the same state since 2007. The demographics of the statistic include 89% of these individuals identifying as female, 30% being legally considered minors, and 54% being U.S. citizens. With Arizona's location being so close to the Mexican border, the state is vulnerable to higher levels of sex trafficking. More specifically, Phoenix is considered to be the second largest sex trafficking hub in the United States. These factors provide reasoning behind why we are focusing on this location today, and additionally recommending that there needs to be a more comprehensive program in place that will hold Johns accountable for their actions. The current approaches used throughout the state of Arizona varies from city to city, with the most common being reverse stings, shamings, and web stings. Listed here are the current approaches seen in Phoenix, Arizona, that have been implemented to reduce the prevalence of sex trafficking and human trafficking. Shaming consists of publicly identifying the men who are arrested for buying sex. Shaming comes in many different forms, such as letters sent to the men at their homes, billboards, social media, and websites. Soap orders, or stay out of areas with prostitution, restrict convicted prostitute solicitors from going near the geographical areas that have been identified as areas of prostitution. There are currently two approaches to how to deal with Johns who have been convicted, with the first being criminal charges and the second rehabilitation. The two techniques that are used in the rehabilitation of Johns are psychoeducational programs and John schools. The rehabilitation of Johns, instead of solely criminal charges, gives the men an opportunity to understand their role in sex trafficking and the consequences that are felt throughout a community. Psychoeducational programs have been designed and implemented to help solicitors understand the impact that their behaviors have on their own lives. These programs are defined as psychoeducational to clarify the emphasis on educational rather than therapeutic purposes. John schools are available for men who are facing criminal charges. They are offered a chance to take part in educational classes or a multi-session counseling that can reduce or dismiss their charges. There is no clear and structured approach to the classes and programs that are available in the various cities around the United States. The length of classes and programs can range from 1 to 10 days and have various techniques used in the classes. The fact that there is no clear and structured approach is apparent in the percentage of effectiveness that can be found in the different cities. While these tactics are helpful in the reduction of sex trafficking, they do not deter Johns as well as other cities and countries who have implemented John schools. Buffalo, New York saw a 60% reduction in reports of prostitution activity after the initiation of John schools between 1996 and 1997. San Francisco found a reduction rate of over 40% from the use of John schools instead of only criminal charges, and New Jersey has seen a reduction of 75% in the same area. Ipswich, England saw a reduction of 40 to 80% after enacting Curb Crawler, which consists of arrest and mandatory John school attendance. Sweden took another route in the reduction of demand of prostitution by changing the law in 1999 that decriminalized the sale of sex, but not the purchasing of sex, and this led to the reduction of street prostitution by 50 to 70%. To reduce demand for illicit sex trafficking, the Arizona state legislature should amend the already existing sanctions for the crime of soliciting prostitutes. Currently, purchasers of illicit sex, commonly referred to as Johns, are eligible to be charged with solicitation of prostitution in most jurisdictions, a misdemeanor, commonly punishable by a $150 fine. We suggest that educational programs are implemented into the already existing sanctions of Arizona. The goal in our recommendations was to reach purchasers of illicit sex with an educational program that is intended to give them a new perspective on the far-reaching implications of the crime they are committing. To ensure those educational programs are utilized by the court, this recommendation offers the defendant an opportunity to defer being charged instead of participating in an educational program. We base this suggestion off of the success of these already implemented programs in various cities. According to a study published in 2002 by the Canadian Journal of Criminology, participants who attended educational programs built around teaching Johns the effects and consequences of their actions reported a deeper understanding of these effects and consequences. In a 2004 study by the Journal of Offender Rehabilitation, it was recorded that the men considered Johns who attended the same types of educational programs reported a greater sense of empathy towards sex workers. More importantly, a study based out of San Francisco reported that when looking at reoffending rates, participants of John schools' reoffending rates dropped by 40%. It is our suggestion that Arizona implements the same type of program after analyzing the success of it in other areas. At successful completion of this educational program, the criminal charges would then be declined, in effect allowing the defendant to avoid conviction and the resulting criminal record. While this education program is relatively expensive, it should be preferable to a misdemeanor conviction of a crime of moral turpitude, a crime that in some instances might preclude one from qualifying for jobs. To summarize, we recommend that at first arrest, the prosecuting attorney will mandate a deferred prosecution contingent on the defendant completing a one-day course surrounding the consequences of prostitution and human trafficking. This defendant will therefore be responsible for a mandatory $500 fine to be placed in a revolving fund and used by the state to pay for educational facilities and instructors. The amount of the fine comes from the National Criminal Justice Reference Service, which states that the average fee for John schools is around $400, but ranges up to $1,500. Repeat offenses of solicitation of prostitution call for a more stringent education program. After analyzing a program in Seattle providing education to Johns by the Organization for Prostitution Survivors through a rigorous 10-week program, results showed that 95% of the program's participants stated they don't think that they will solicit prostitution again. A 10-weekend course would allow for an in-depth examination as to the health, community, and societal costs of prostitution and sex trafficking. This course would necessarily be more expensive. Therefore, we recommend that for the second offense, the defendant would be convicted of a misdemeanor, fined $1,000 in order to fund the educational program, and participate in 10 consecutive weekend educational courses surrounding the effects and consequences of sex trafficking and soliciting prostitutes. Specifically, the amount suggested for this mandatory fine comes from the NCJRS findings and average fine amounts to fund John schools, with the first offense of $500 being closer to the average U.S. fine of $400. We want to increase the fine of the second offense to be closer to the higher end of the spectrum suggested by the U.S. averages at $1,000. Lastly, should reoffending for a third time occur, after a defendant has completed the 10-weekend course, the court system would revert back to the existent punitive sanction systems, but with an increased and mandatory sentence of 1 year on the county jail. We include the driver license suspension in this third offense because, according to Shively 2012, Johns frequently elicit illegal sex through the use of a vehicle. We include a minimum 1 year in county jail to these recommendations because, in a study listed by Shively 2012, when men were asked what consequences would deter them from eliciting illegal sex, 82% listed jail as a defining deterrent. Although harsher, this recommendation still allows courts to avoid prison overcrowding by maintaining the misdemeanor categorization of this offense, allowing jail time to be served at the local county level. Lastly, defendants convicted of this charge would be susceptible to a mandatory fine reaching up to $10,000. The increase in fines is important for the continuation and maintenance of these educational programs. In San Francisco, the Offender Prostitution Program has produced over $3 million in revenue since 1995. This revenue was able to cover all costs for John schools. It covered 88% of processing fees for these arrestees in the San Francisco District Attorney's Office. It covered 1/3 of the San Francisco's Police Department's sting operation costs and produced over $1 million in fee revenue to support programs offering help for women and girls who are survived this harsh reality. The fines put into place in Nashville accrued over $100,000 to directly support the Magdalene program, which assists survivors of the commercial sex industry. Our goal here is to lessen the demand for illicit sex crimes in order to reduce the amount of human trafficking fueling this epidemic. In order to achieve this goal, we aim to increase education for the purchasers to show them the inhumane and unacceptable means that sex workers experience in the U.S. The hope here is to decrease the amount of demand. Provided below are the references used to build this presentation. Thank you for listening.